There's a particular kind of silence that falls over a room when something ancient speaks. Not the silence of empty space, not the silence of sleep, the kind that presses against your eardrums like deep water, the kind your body recognizes before your brain does. The veil theory had a word for it. Sothvel, loosely translated, it meant the quiet before a thing that cannot be taken back. They heard that silence the day the Oracle of Drenkai Prime opened its 17 mouths and said, in 17 languages simultaneously, that the two-legged creatures from the third rock of a forgettable yellow star were coming. And then, because the veil theory were ancient and powerful and had not lost a war in 11,000 years, they laughed. Every civilization in the conclave laughed. The Durek, who built their cities from compressed starlight. The Sen Collective, whose hive minds spanned 4 star systems. The Pale Architects, who had engineered the death of 3 sons as a territorial demonstration. They all laughed. You need to understand something about laughter. In every species that has ever evolved it, laughter serves the same base function. It is the sound a mind makes when it decides something is not a threat. It is the cognitive equivalent of turning your back. The Oracle did not laugh. The Oracle had seen what humans did to the last species that turned its back on them. It had seen the math. The terrifying, beautiful, obscene math of what happens when you take a creature that should have died 100 times over, by ice, by plague, by its own spectacular violence, and instead of dying, it adapted. What happens when evolution builds something with the emotional range of a thunderstorm and the memory of an elephant and the stubbornness of a geological formation, and then, crucially, gives it the ability to feel insulted? The Oracle tried to explain this. The Conclave kept laughing. What follows is the account of what happened next. Compiled from Veil Theory military archives, Durek survivor testimony, and 17 hours of untranslated audio recovered from the wreckage of the Sin Collective's primary hive node. Audio that, when finally decoded, contained only one repeating phrase in a human language. We told you we were coming. The Oracle was not wrong. It was simply not believed. Those are different things. And the distance between them, measured not in light years but in graves, is the length of this story. The Oracle of Drenkai Prime was not a machine, though it was easier to think of it that way. It was not alive either, though it bled when cut. A slow, luminous bleed that smelled of copper and old libraries. It existed somewhere between these two states, the way certain truths exist between comfortable and real. The Veil Theory had built it 40,000 years ago from the compressed consciousness of 3 dead civilizations, which meant it remembered things that no living mind had witnessed. It remembered the rise of the Sen. It remembered the burning of the old conclave. It remembered every species that had ever crawled up from the mud of some unremarkable planet and become something that other species had to start accounting for. It had seen this pattern before. That was the thing the Veil Theory forgot. They thought the Oracle was issuing a new warning. They did not understand that it was issuing an old one. The same warning it had tried to give 6 times in 40,000 years. And 6 times had been dismissed, and 6 times the dismissing civilization had not survived long enough to regret the dismissal. The Oracle had no opinion about this. It had processed opinion out of itself early in its existence, because opinion interfered with accuracy. It simply stated what it calculated. And what it calculated, on the morning of the 43rd Grand Assembly of the Galactic Conclave, was this: the humans were approaching. They had been detected 11 years prior by a Durek long-range sensor array, their signal small and inconsistent. A single vessel, primitive by Conclave standards, running on chemical propulsion supplemented by something that looked like a captured solar wind. The Durek had flagged it as a curiosity, a data point, something for the xenological archives. They sent a routine probe to observe and log the encounter under a category that translated roughly as pre-emergent species, non-threat, monitor passively. The probe returned 18 months later with footage that should have alarmed someone. It alarmed no one, because the footage showed a ship that should not have worked. This is important. The Durek engineers who reviewed the footage spent 3 days analyzing the human vessel's propulsion system and could not reach consensus on how it was functional. The mathematics suggested it should have shaken itself apart 6 months into the journey. The structural integrity of the hull was technically insufficient for the speed it was traveling. The life support readings were operating within ranges that Dura classified as critical emergency conditions, oxygen percentages that their own physiologists said would cause incapacitation within days. And yet the ship kept moving. And yet the life signs inside it kept registering as active, as working, as improbably fine. One junior engineer wrote in her report, * they appear to be operating on a principle we have not categorized. Suggest further study. * The report was filed. Nobody did further study. The category remained non-threat. The Oracle watched all of this. It processed the footage. It ran its calculations. It cross-referenced against its archive of 6 previous emergence events, 6 other species that had appeared without invitation in the territory of established civilizations, and what had followed. The numbers came back the same every time. Not because the Oracle was biased, because the pattern was real. On the morning of the 43rd Grand Assembly, it opened its 17 mouths. The Veiltheri Elder Council was present, all 9 of them, in their high-backed seats of compressed matter, wearing the ceremonial light weavings that indicated supreme authority. They were old even by Veiltheri standards. The youngest was 4,000 years of age, which meant she remembered the last genuine military conflict in Conclave history and considered it a youthful indiscretion. They had not fought a war in 11,000 years. They had negotiated every territorial dispute, absorbed every challenger, outmaneuvered every aggressive newcomer through a combination of technological superiority and diplomatic craft that was genuinely, objectively impressive. They were proud of this. They had reason to be. They were also, the Oracle had calculated, completely unprepared for what was coming. The Oracle said, * a 2-legged species from the 3rd planet of star system, G2V, 447 has achieved faster-than-light adjacency, and is moving through outer conclave territory. Their trajectory suggests intent. Their history suggests capability. This is a first-contact situation with a Category 7 emergence profile. Recommend immediate diplomatic engagement under maximum security protocols. * Category 7. In the Oracle's classification system, categories ran from 1 to 8. 1 was a species that had achieved basic space travel and posed no threat to anyone. 8 was a species that had demonstrated the ability to end civilizations. Category 7 was the designation for a species that had not yet done so, but whose profile suggested they were capable of it, and whose early behavior indicated they were moving in that direction. In 40,000 years of operation, the Oracle had issued a Category 7 designation 4 times. All 4 previous Category 7 species were now either members of the Conclave or extinct. The Oracle did not consider this a coincidence. It was simply the resolution of a mathematical pattern. Category 7 species were, by definition, the kind of species that forced a resolution. They were not content to be observed. They were not content to be filed under monitor passively. They arrived, and they demanded to be accounted for, and the Conclave either found a way to account for them or they stopped being the Conclave. The Elder Council received this information in silence. Then Veiltheri Elder Safin, who was the oldest and most decorated of them, and who had personally negotiated the absorption of the Menari Collective into the Conclave 400 years prior, leaned back in his seat and said, "What do they want?" The Oracle said, *unknown. "They have not communicated. They're simply moving." Sothkaran said, "How many ships?" The Oracle said, "1. And that was when the laughter started. Not cruel laughter. Not dismissive in the way of contempt. It was the laughter of genuine relief. The laughter of 9 very old, very powerful beings who had braced themselves for a real problem and been handed, instead, something that felt manageable. 1 ship. 1 primitive ship from a species that hadn't even worked out consistent faster-than-light travel yet, moving through the outer edge of Conclave territory. The Oracle had classified this as a Category 7 emergence profile, which, Given what the Veil Theory knew about the Oracle's history of overcalibrated threat assessment, seemed like exactly the kind of overcalibration that the Oracle was occasionally prone to. They had debated this before. The Oracle was a 40,000-year-old system built from the consciousness of dead civilizations. It had, over the millennia, developed certain tendencies, a disposition toward worst-case framing, a pattern of escalating threat assessment on emerging species that had, more than once, led the Council to mobilize resources for conflicts that resolved themselves diplomatically within decades. The Sin Collective itself had been flagged as a Category 6 emergence, which everyone now agreed had been excessive. The Sin were difficult diplomatic partners, but hardly an existential concern. The Oracle's threat categories, the Elder Council had quietly concluded, were calibrated for a more violent era. Soth Karun, still smiling, said, send a diplomatic envoy. Standard first contact protocol. And thank the Oracle for its vigilance. The last part was said kindly. The Oracle did not experience kindness or its absence. It processed the instruction and logged it. Then, it ran its calculations one more time because it always ran its calculations one more time, and the numbers came back the same. Category 7. Recommend maximum security protocols. The diplomatic envoy was dispatched 3 weeks later. It was a mid-tier vessel, not the flagship, which was reserved for contacts with peer-level civilizations, but a respectable ship crewed by 43 of the Veil Theory's most experienced first contact specialists. They had made contact with 26 new species in the last 2,000 years. They knew the protocols. They had the translation matrices. They carried gifts, which was standard, and they carried weapons, which was also standard, and they were confident in a way that 43 very experienced beings can be confident when they have never, in their professional lifetimes, encountered a situation they couldn't navigate. They found the human ship in the outer belt of the Keth system, drifting at a velocity that suggested the humans had dropped out of whatever approximated faster-than-light travel for them, and were doing something the Veil Theory sensor operator described in her log as coasting and looking around. This struck the first contact team as charming. It was the behavior of a species that was curious, exploratory, not aggressive. The tension that had been building in the envoy ship since departure eased considerably. The lead diplomat, a 700-year-old specialist named Valanthe, prepared the standard greeting package. It included a mathematical introduction, primes, ratios, the universal language of first contact, followed by a visual display of the conclave's territorial boundaries, which served the dual purpose of welcome and gentle warning. We are here. This is our space. We are pleased to meet you. Please do not make this complicated. They broadcast it toward the human ship. For 6 hours, nothing happened. Then, the human ship broadcast back. What it sent was not mathematics. It was not a visual display. What it sent, and the translation matrix would spend the next 8 months unpacking this, was what appeared to be an audio recording of a conversation between 2 humans, apparently taking place inside the ship, apparently not intended to be a formal response. As if someone had hit the wrong button. The translation matrix eventually rendered it as follows. Human 1, you're actually doing it. Human 2, I'm doing it. Human 1, if you get us all killed. Human 2, I'm not going to get us all killed. Human 1, you said that on Titan. Human 2, Titan was fine. Human 1, 3 people lost fingers. Human 2, their fingers were fine eventually. Mostly. Valanthe listened to this translation 4 times. Then, she turned to her senior communications officer and said, "What does this mean?" The senior communications officer, who had studied 67 languages and the cultural context that produced them, said after a long pause, "I think it means they're not afraid of us." Valanthe considered this. In 26 first contacts, every species had been afraid. Not necessarily hostile, not necessarily aggressive, but afraid in the way that any species is afraid when it encounters something larger and older and more powerful than itself. Fear was the expected response. Fear was, frankly, the appropriate response. It was the response that made first contact manageable. Not afraid, Valanthe repeated. Not even slightly, said her communications officer. In fact, she paused, running the translation again. I think the second one is excited. Valanthe filed her preliminary report that evening. She was careful in her wording. She noted the anomalous communication response. She noted the apparent absence of fear-based behavioral markers. She noted that the human ship had, while they were parsing the transmission, moved 11,000 kilometers closer to the envoy vessel without altering its approach vector, which in any other first contact situation would have been flagged as aggressive positioning, but which felt, somehow, more like a species leaning forward in its chair. She ended her report with a line that would, later, be quoted in every Veil Theory post-war analysis ever written. Recommend we do not dismiss the Oracle's Category 7 assessment. These beings are strange in ways I do not yet have language for. The Elder Council received her report 2 weeks later. Sothgren, reviewing it, noted that Valanthe was an excellent diplomat who had a tendency toward overcaution in early contact scenarios. He noted that the human ship had made no aggressive moves. He noted that the exchange, strange as it was, suggested internal conflict within the human crew, which typically indicated a disorganized and, therefore, manageable opponent. He sent back a message to Valanthe. Proceed with standard protocol. We will open formal negotiations within the year. He did not revise the threat category. He did not implement maximum security protocols. He did not ask what had happened on Titan and whether anyone's fingers had actually been fine. The Oracle of Drinkai Prime logged the decision. It ran its calculations. It said nothing because it had already said everything, and it had not been heard, and it was a system built for accuracy and not for the particular human art of making people listen. In the outer belt of the Keth system, the human ship drifted a little closer. Inside it, according to a log recovered many years later, one of the crew members was making a list. The list was titled, Things They Probably Don't Know About Us Yet. It was, by the time of recovery, very long. The Veil Theory would spend the next decade learning every item on it. Not from the list. From experience. The way humans had always preferred to teach. Not with words, but by making the lesson unavoidable. The Oracle had seen this before. It waited. It was very good at waiting. What it was not able to do, what no system built from dead civilizations' regret could ever do, was make the living ones believe the dead ones had died for a reason. That was a lesson every civilization had to learn on its own. Some learned it in time. The Veil Theory were about to find out which kind they were. The human ship in the outer belt kept moving. 11,000 kilometers had become 9,000. Then 7. Then 5. Valanthe, watching the sensors, noted this in her log with the careful, precise handwriting of someone who had lived 700 years and was beginning to suspect for the first time in all of them that she was watching something she did not have the right reference points to understand. She wrote, they're not approaching us. They are approaching what they think we might become to them. I do not know what that is yet. I'm not sure they know either. But they're very sure it is worth moving toward. She closed her log. Outside, the human ship kept coming. The Veil Theory had 11 years before they would understand what that meant. The Oracle had 11 years to wait. It had waited longer before. It had never yet been wrong. The formal negotiations began on a station in neutral space that the Veil Theory had constructed in 6 weeks, which they considered unremarkable, and the human delegation considered deeply impressive, though they didn't say so. They just kept walking through the corridors with their hands clasped behind their backs, and their eyes moving over the walls with the focused attention of people memorizing things they plan to replicate later. Valanthe noticed this. She noted it in her log. She brought it up in the pre-session briefing. Her superior at the time, a council-appointed negotiator named Drathvel, who had been running diplomatic engagements for 2,000 years and considered himself something of an authority on the subject, told her she was anthropomorphizing. They weren't memorizing. They were simply being tourists. All first contact species were tourists in their first hours aboard a conclave facility. It was natural. It meant nothing. Valanthe said nothing. She kept watching the humans. There were 7 of them in the delegation. The lead diplomat was a woman named Commander Elena Vasquez, which the translation matrix rendered accurately, but which none of the Veil Theory could pronounce without sounding like they were chewing on something. She was 44 years old, which in the Veil Theory metric made her approximately an infant. She had very short-cropped dark hair, a scar along her jaw that she never explained, and a habit of arriving to every session 12 minutes early and spending those 12 minutes not sitting, not reviewing materials, but standing in the center of the room and looking at the ceiling. Nobody asked her why. The human delegation seemed to consider this normal behavior. Drathvel found this unsettling in a way he couldn't adequately articulate, so he stopped thinking about it. This was his first mistake. The negotiations themselves, in the early weeks, went well by every conventional standard. The humans were engaged, attentive, and asked intelligent questions. Their technology, reviewed by Veil Theory engineers in the data-sharing portion of the exchange, was assessed as roughly 400 years behind Conclave standard, advanced in certain narrow areas, primitive in the ones that mattered. Their weapons systems, specifically, were noted as conventional kinetic and energy-based, with no access to the phase disruption or gravity compression technologies that Conclave militaries had operated with for the last millennium. This was reassuring. Phase disruption was the capability that made a species genuinely dangerous at scale. Without it, no matter how motivated, a species was constrained in the damage it could do to a Conclave fleet. The Veil Theory military advisors, reviewing the technical assessment, put it in their files under a category that translated as limited capacity, manageable if necessary, non-urgent. Nobody asked how the humans had gotten their ship to hold together when the physics said it shouldn't. Nobody went back to that question. It remained the way it had been filed 11 years prior, as a curiosity. Vasquez, in the 7th week of negotiations, asked a question that stopped the room. She asked, "What do you do with species you can't negotiate with?" Drathvel, after a pause, said that was not a question that arose often. The Conclave had a strong track record of successful integration. There were historical cases of species that had chosen hostility over cooperation, but those cases were resolved through, he used the standard diplomatic phrasing, necessary force at minimum required scale. Vasquez looked at him for a moment. Not a suspicious look, not an aggressive look. The kind of look that, in humans, Valanthe was learning to read as a person cross-referencing what they're hearing against what they already know. Vasquez said, "What does minimum required scale mean?" Drathvel said it meant the force sufficient to achieve resolution without excessive resource expenditure. Vasquez said, "Right?" And then she wrote something in the small notebook she carried everywhere, an actual paper notebook, which the Veil Theory staff found both quaint and incomprehensible, and moved on to the next point on the agenda. Valanthe, watching from her position along the wall, wrote in her own log that evening. Asterisk, she knows what it means. She was not asking because she didn't know. She was asking to hear him say it. She is building a picture of us. I am beginning to think she has been building it since she first arrived. Asterisk, the negotiations concluded their first phase 8 months later with a preliminary accord on territorial boundaries and a trade framework that was, by Conclave standards, tilted substantially in the Conclave's favor. This was standard. The Conclave always negotiated from strength in early-stage agreements. The humans would benefit from the arrangement. They got access to certain Conclave communication networks and a symbolic seat on the outer rim of the Conclave Advisory Council, but the core power balance was unambiguous. The Conclave was the dominant party. The humans were a promising newcomer being granted graduated access. The signing ceremony was formal and well-attended. All 9 members of the Elder Council appeared via projection. Sothkarun gave a speech about the long tradition of peaceful expansion and the Conclave's commitment to elevating emerging species. It was a good speech. He had given a version of it 23 times before. Vasquez gave a shorter speech. She said, "Asterisk, we accept these terms. We will honor them exactly as written. We want you to know that we read every page." Asterisk, she paused. "Every footnote, too." There was polite applause. The ceremony concluded. The humans returned to their ship. In the 3 years that followed, They honored the agreement exactly as written. They also sent a message back to Earth. Classified content properly within their rights under the agreement. What was not within their rights, technically, was the volume of data they transmitted, which was substantially larger than what the Accord specified as permissible. The Veil Theory Communication Monitoring System flagged it twice. Both times it was reviewed, noted as a minor technical violation, and filed under ongoing monitoring required. Nobody sent a formal complaint. The Accord was still new. Nobody wanted to strain the relationship over a data transmission overage. In hindsight, this was the moment things turned. Because what humans had transmitted home in those oversized data packets was not personal correspondence or scientific observation reports, which was what the official manifest listed. What they had transmitted was everything. The layout of the Keth system station. The Veil Theory fleet deployment patterns they'd observed during approach. The technical specifications, as much as could be inferred from observation, of every piece of conclave technology they'd been allowed near. The negotiating behavior of Drathvel, annotated with what appeared to be psychological assessments that were startlingly accurate. The ceiling Vasquez had spent 12 minutes studying before every session, which turned out to be a structural map she had been reading in the material composition striations. And something else. The transmission included a document that the Veil Theory intelligence analysts, when they finally decrypted it, 14 months after the fact, because they hadn't prioritized decryption of what they'd assumed was personal correspondence, described in their report as a threat assessment of the entire conclave, written from the perspective of an opposing military power, detailed to a degree that suggests either a significant intelligence operation or an extraordinary capacity for inference. From limited observation, the document was titled, in English, What We're Up Against. It was 47 pages long. It was accurate on every point the Veil Theory could verify. And it included at the end a section titled where they're vulnerable that the Veil Theory intelligence chief, an 1100-year veteran named Sothmerith, read 3 times before setting down and saying to her staff, quietly, these are our actual vulnerabilities. How do they find these? Her staff had no answer. The document went to the Elder Council. Sothkarun read it. He read it again. He called an emergency session. Drathvel, present at the session, said that the document was concerning, but that its existence proved nothing beyond good analytical capability. Many species engaged in this kind of strategic assessment. It was normal state behavior. It did not constitute a threat. Sothmerith, who had spent 1100 years in intelligence and had no patience for comfortable interpretations, said, they wrote this document after 8 months of official contact. 8 months. We have been studying them for 11 years, and our own strategic assessment of them is 40% less detailed than what they compiled on us in 8 months. Silence. She continued, they sent it home, which means Earth has this document. Earth has been preparing based on this document for 14 months, while we were still assuming the transmissions were personal letters. More silence. Sothkarun said, what is the recommended course of action? Sothmerith said, I recommend we contact the Oracle. Sothkarun said, the Oracle has already given its assessment. Sothmerith said, yes. It has. There was a long pause. In the Veil Theory tradition, a pause of that length in a High Council session was called Sothvel, the quiet before the thing that cannot be taken back. It had its own word because it happened often enough to need one. Sothkarun, to his credit, did not flinch from what the pause meant. He said, we revisit the Oracle's assessment. We revise our classification of humans. We approach the next contact with appropriate. A message arrived. It arrived through the Conclave's standard communication network, routed through the diplomatic channel, addressed to the Elder Council directly. It was from Commander Vasquez. The message said, in full, we've received word from Earth. They'd like to send a larger delegation. We're looking forward to deeper cooperation. Also, we know you read the document. We meant you to eventually. We wanted you to know that we know where we stand. See you soon. The Elder Council stared at the message for a long time. Sothmerith eventually said, Asterisk, they sent the document knowing we'd decrypt it. They factored the decryption lag into their timeline. They sent it 14 months before they wanted us to find it. Asterisk, Drathvel said. That would require them to have modeled our intelligence processing speed with sufficient accuracy to— Yes, Asterisk, said Sothmerith. The room was quiet. Outside, in the outer belt, the original human ship had been joined by 3 others. They had arrived in the preceding week, which the monitoring system had flagged as routine. Additional human presence was permitted under the accord. Nobody had thought to count whether 3 new ships exceeded the spirit, if not the letter, of the territorial limit clauses. Nobody had thought to ask what was on those ships. The Oracle of Drinkai Prime, when queried that evening by Sothmerith, said the same thing it had always said. Category 7. Maximum security protocols. And something else, something Sothmerith hadn't asked for, which the Oracle had apparently generated independently, cross-referencing the new data. It said, asterisk note for record. Human strategic doctrine appears to incorporate a pattern this system has previously observed in one other Category 7 species, the Kelvreth emergence, year 12,440 of Conclave record. The Kelvreth did not fight with their strongest weapons first. They fought with the weapons their opponents were prepared for. This was not restraint. It was information gathering. The Council chose not to apply this data point in their response. The Kelvreth were reclassified as an existential threat in year 12,447. The conflict concluded in year 12,501 with Kelvreth absorption at significant conclave cost. This oracle calculates a 94.7% probability that the human pattern matches the Kelvreth profile. This oracle recommends the Council does not repeat year 12,440's assessment error. Asterisk, Sothmerith read this 3 times. She brought it to Sothkarun. He read it twice. And then he looked out the window of the council chamber at the stars, and in the particular silence of a 4,000-year-old being realizing he might have made a serious error, he said, "How long do we have?" The oracle said, asterisk, the larger human delegation arrives in 6 weeks. This oracle calculates that the nature of the subsequent contact will determine whether the pattern resolves as the Kelvreth resolution or as an alternative outcome. Asterisk, Sothkarun said, "What is the alternative outcome?" The oracle said, asterisk, this oracle has not yet modeled it. Humans are a statistical anomaly. Their behavior does not consistently map to prior Category 7 profiles. There is a 5.3% probability space this oracle cannot account for. Asterisk, Sothkarun, for the first time in 4,000 years, felt something that he would not name, but which pressed against the inside of his chest like deep water. 5.3%, asterisk, he said. Yes, asterisk, said the oracle. He had laughed, once, at the oracle's warning. He was not laughing now. Outside, moving through the dark, were 4 human ships, and somewhere behind them, at a distance that was closing daily, were more. The conclave, which had not fought a war in 11,000 years, began, quietly, to dust off the concept. The oracle logged this. It ran its numbers. It waited. It had been waiting 40,000 years for a civilization to listen before it was too late. It was still waiting. It would wait 6 more weeks, and then the larger delegation would arrive, and the waiting would end, and something else would begin. Something that had no entry in the Oracle's archives because nothing exactly like it had ever happened before. That 5.3% was the most dangerous number in the galaxy, and it had a human face. The larger delegation arrived in 4 ships that were, by Veil Theory sensor assessment, approximately twice the mass of the original vessel and running propulsion signatures that did not match anything in the Conclave's human technology database, which was not, technically, a violation of the Accord. The Accord specified nothing about propulsion development. Nobody had thought to specify it, because the assumption had been that 400 years of technological gap did not close in 3 years. The assumption was wrong. The Veil Theory engineering team flagged the propulsion anomaly within hours of the fleet's arrival. The flag went to Sothmerith, who had, in the 6 weeks since the Oracle's updated assessment, quietly placed herself in operational command of everything relating to human contact. She read the engineering report over her morning meal, set it down, and spent a long time looking at the window. Then, she went to see the Oracle. She asked it, "How does a species advance 400 years in 3?" The Oracle said, "Asterisk, they do not advance 400 years in 3 years. They reveal 400 years in 3 years." The assessment of their starting point was based on what they showed us in the first contact vessel. This system calculates a 78% probability that the first contact vessel was not representative of their actual technological baseline. Asterisk, Sophmerith said, "They sent a primitive ship on purpose." The Oracle said, "This system calculates a 78% probability that this is the case." She sat with that for a while. In 1100 years of intelligence work, she had seen deception in many forms. Species that overstated their capabilities. Species that concealed vulnerabilities. Diplomatic performances calibrated to specific outcomes. She had seen all of this and had developed a taxonomy for it, a way of filing each type under a category that made it manageable. This did not fit any of her categories, because what the humans appeared to have done was not conceal strength out of fear. They had not downgraded their presentation because they were afraid of how the conclave would respond to their full capability. The psychological profile didn't support that reading. These were not, by any behavioral metric, a species operating from a position of fear. They had sent the primitive ship because they wanted to see how the conclave would treat a species they perceived as weak. It was a test. The conclave had passed it in the way a species passes a test when it doesn't know it's being administered, by being exactly what it was unselfconsciously, with no performance for an audience it didn't know was watching. The conclave had been condescending, measured, confident in a way that assumed the measured party had no recourse. The negotiations had been tilted. The accord had favored the conclave. Drathvel had spoken to Vasquez the way a person speaks to a student they expect to be grateful for access to the classroom. Sophmerith thought about the document, what we're up against, and realized she had been reading it wrong. She had read it as a military threat assessment. It was that. But underneath that, it was something else. It was a profile, a character study of the conclave, of how the conclave behaved when it thought no one important was watching. The humans had decided what the conclave was in those 8 months, and then they had gone home and prepared accordingly. Sophmerith wrote in her log, "Asterisk, we did not fail a test of strength. We failed a test of character. These are different failures, and they require different responses. I'm not sure the council understands this yet." Asterisk, the second delegation's lead was not Vasquez. Vasquez was there, sitting to one side, watching the small notebook open in her lap. The lead was a man named General Tobias Adeyemi, who was physically the largest human any of the Veil Theory had encountered. Not in a manner that required comment, but in the way that a room changes slightly when a certain type of person enters it, and everyone notices without saying so. He moved like someone who had spent a long time in environments where moving wrong had consequences. He was 51 years old. He had the eyes of someone who had made decisions he lived with in the way you live with furniture, always there, arranged around the shape of your days. He sat down across from Drathvel, who had been retained because replacing him mid-process would signal internal conclave disruption. Adeyemi said, "I'm going to be direct with you." Drathvel said, pleasantly, "We welcome directness," Adeyemi said. Asterisk, good. Then, directly, the accord you negotiated with our first delegation isn't going to hold. Not because we plan to break it, because you wrote several clauses that benefit from being vague, and vague clauses and agreements between parties with unequal power always resolve in favor of the powerful party, and we've been briefed on how that's gone for other species you've integrated. We're not interested in that trajectory. Asterisk, there was a silence in the room with a specific texture. The texture of something shifting beneath the surface. Drathvel said, carefully, the accord was negotiated in good faith. Adeyemi said, asterisk, I'm sure it was. Good faith isn't the same as balanced terms. Asterisk, he opened a folder, an actual physical folder, paper inside it, which seemed to be something humans did when they wanted you to understand they had done their homework. and slid it across the table. Asterisk, we've drafted revised terms. They're reasonable. I'd ask you to read them before responding. Asterisk Drathvel looked at the folder. Valanthe, from her position along the wall, was already reading the room. She watched Adeyemi. She watched Vasquez, who was writing in her notebook with the focused calm of someone transcribing rather than composing. She watched Sothmerith, who was present as an observer and who, Valanthe noticed, was the only person in the Veil Theory delegation who did not look surprised. The rest of them looked surprised. Even Drathvel, experienced as he was, had a stillness that was not the stillness of composure. It was the stillness of someone recalculating. Because humans are not supposed to do this. A first contact species, 400 years behind technologically, did not sit across the table from a 2,000-year diplomatic veteran and slide a folder of revised terms across it. That was not how emergence worked. Emergent species came in with deference and gratitude and a clear understanding of where they sat in the hierarchy, and they worked their way up over centuries while the conclave managed the pace. Adeyemi had apparently not received this memo. He sat there, hands folded, waiting for them to read the folder, with the particular patience of a person who is confident they have already won the room and is simply giving the room time to catch up. Drathvel opened the folder. He read for 11 minutes without speaking. When he closed it, he said, "These terms assume a degree of military parity that—" "No," asterisk said Adeyemi, pleasantly. Asterisk, they assume a degree of military potential that you haven't fully assessed yet. There's a difference, asterisk Drathvel said. Your technology is what we've shown you, asterisk said Adeyemi, which is not the same as what we have. He let that sit. Asterisk, I'm not threatening you. I want to be clear about that. I'm describing a situation so we can negotiate from accurate premises instead of premises that were built on an incomplete picture. Asterisk Valanthe wrote in her log that evening. Asterisk, he is not lying. He is also not bluffing. He is doing something I don't have a category for. He is telling us the truth about a gap in our knowledge and allowing us to sit with the implications without filling them in for us. He is negotiating with the space where our certainty used to be. Asterisk, the Durek representative in the session filed a report to his own government that contained a sentence which would later become, in Durek political history, the most quoted line from this period. Asterisk, they are not the species we assessed. I do not know what species we assessed, but it was not this one. Asterisk, the Sync Collective's observer, a cluster of 11 linked minds, present as a single diplomatic unit, processed the session in real time and arrived at a consensus assessment that it transmitted back to the Hive node in 3 words: begin contingency planning. The session ended after 4 hours with an agreement to adjourn for 1 week, while the conclave reviewed the proposed revised terms. Adeyemi shook hands with Drathvel, an act the translation matrix had long since identified as a human bonding gesture, but which felt, in that moment, less like a greeting and more like punctuation, and left with his delegation. Vasquez, last to leave, paused at the door. She looked at Valanthe. She said, asterisk, you've been writing in your log since the 2nd week. You're the only one on your team who's been paying actual attention. Asterisk Valanthe said nothing. Vasquez said, I just wanted you to know that we noticed. And then she left. The Veil Theory held an emergency Elder Council session that evening. The revised terms were reviewed by legal analysts, military advisors, and economists. The consensus, presented to Soth Karun by Sothmerith, was this. The revised terms were not unreasonable. They were, in fact, closer to what a genuinely equitable accord between 2 spacefaring species should look like. The terms the Conclave had originally negotiated were revealed, under review, to be substantially exploitative, not unusually so by Conclave standards, but the standard itself, when laid out in comparative document form, did not look good. Soth Karun said, What happens if we reject the revisions? Sothmerith said, This oracle, I consulted it this afternoon, calculates a 67% probability of direct conflict within 18 months, Soth Karun said. And if we accept, Sothmerith said, asterisk unknown. The oracle's model breaks down. It says the humans don't map cleanly to prior patterns when they're negotiating from a position they consider honest. Asterisk, there was a pause. Soth Karun said, they want a genuine partnership. Soth Marith said, asterisk, I think that's what they came here for. Yes, asterisk, and when we treated them as something to be managed, asterisk, he said slowly, they began planning for the alternative. Yes, asterisk, she said. He looked at the window for a long time. The 3 years of carefully observed restraint. The primitive ship that wasn't primitive. The document they'd sent home, not as a threat, but as insurance. The folder of revised terms that they'd drafted before they'd arrived, which meant they had already anticipated this moment, had already modeled his reaction, had already decided how to respond to whichever version of this conversation he produced. They had planned for his best case and his worst case and every variation between. They had arrived 3 years ago, and every day since had been preparation. Not for war, for this room, for this conversation, where a 4,000-year-old being finally looked across a table and saw them clearly. And what he saw was not what the Oracle's Category 7 designation had described. It was not a threat profile. It was not an emergence pattern matching the Kelvreth. It was something older and stranger and more difficult to classify than any of those things. It was a species that had spent its entire existence being underestimated and had learned, in the bone-deep way that only comes from millennia of surviving it, exactly what to do with that. They didn't rage against it. They didn't try to prove themselves before the moment was right. They waited. They watched. They built a picture while the other side was busy not taking them seriously. And then, when the moment came, they sat down across the table and they opened a folder. And they waited again, not with the patience of fear, with the patience of certainty. Soth Karun, for 1,000 years old, powerful enough to have absorbed civilizations, said to Soth Marith, Asterisk, schedule a session with Adeyemi for tomorrow morning. Early. Before the advisors. Asterisk, she said, just you, just me. Asterisk, she paused. What are you going to say to him? He was quiet for a moment. I'm going to say what I should have said when the Oracle first spoke. Asterisk, he looked at the stars outside the window, and at 4 human ships drifting in them, and at everything he had assumed about what those ships contained. Asterisk, I'm going to say that we were wrong about what you were. And I'm going to ask what you actually want. Asterisk, Soth Marith, 1,100 years of intelligence work behind her, said, and if they tell you, he said, then we'll find out if it's too late to give it to them honestly. The window was dark. The stars were old. Outside, the human ships held their position, not aggressive, not retreating, simply present, in the way that things are present when they have decided where they are and are waiting for everyone else to figure out the same. The Oracle of Drinkai Prime, in its chamber on Drinkai Prime, was running a calculation it had never run before. It was trying to model the 5.3%. It was not making progress. For the first time in 40,000 years, it found this interesting rather than frustrating. The humans, it was beginning to suspect, were not an anomaly in its data. They were a new category entirely. It began slowly and with the methodical precision of a consciousness built from accumulated dead wisdom to build that category. It did not yet have a name for it. The name would come later, after tomorrow's session, after whatever Soth Karun said to Adeyemi in that early morning room before the advisors arrived, when it was just 2 beings from different corners of the galaxy sitting across from each other with nothing between them but the thing neither side had said yet. The Oracle waited. Outside, the storm that everyone had expected and nobody had correctly imagined held very still. Storms, when they are patient, are the most dangerous kind. Not because of what they do, because of what they make the people who underestimated them feel. Right before everything changes. The room Soth Karun chose for the morning session was not the official negotiating chamber. It was a smaller room, a council antechamber, really, with 1 long table and no ceremonial fixtures and windows that looked out on open space rather than on the station's interior architecture. He chose it because he had spent 4,000 years in rooms designed to communicate power, and he wanted this to be a different kind of conversation. He arrived at 6 in the morning, station time, and sat down and waited. Adeyemi arrived at 5:58. He had the same 2 minutes of early arrival that Vasquez had used to read ceilings. He used them to stand at the window and look at the stars. Sothkaran let him look. He didn't speak. He waited until Adeyemi had finished his accounting of the sky and turned around and sat down. Then Sothkaran said, "I owe you an honest conversation." Adeyemi said nothing. He waited. "The accord we negotiated," said Sothkaran, was designed to benefit us. Not exclusively. The terms were not punitive. But they were structured in the way we structure agreements with emerging species, which is to say they were structured around our continued management of the relationship, around our judgment about the pace of your access to conclave resources and systems, around an assumption that we knew better than you what you needed and when you should have it. He stopped. Adeyemi was still not speaking. He had a way of inhabiting silence that felt less like absence and more like presence turned inward, all the weight of him focused listening. "I reviewed your revised terms last night." Sothkaran continued. "With my own analysis, without advisors. And I want to tell you something that may be difficult to believe, given how we've conducted this relationship so far. Your terms are fair. They are more fair than ours were. And I am embarrassed that it took us this long to offer them." Adeyemi looked at him. The particular quality of that look, measuring, but not suspicious, waiting for the sentence that contained the condition, was something Sothkaran recognized because he had given it himself in 1,000 negotiations over 4,000 years. The look of a person who has been given everything they asked for and is waiting to find out what it costs. He said, "There's no condition. I'm not negotiating. I'm telling you that we started this relationship wrong, and I want to know if it's possible to start it right." Adeyemi said. "Why?" Sothkaran said, "Because the Oracle has been telling us what you are for 3 years, and we kept filing it unmanageable." He paused. "You are not manageable," Adeyemi said, very quietly. No, we're not. And yet you haven't escalated. No, you have the capability to. Adeyemi was quiet for a moment. He looked at the table. Then he said, "Capability and intent are different things. We've been trying to teach that lesson to ourselves for a long time. We don't always succeed, but it's what we're working toward." Sothkaran said, "What do you want from the conclave?" This was the question. The actual one, underneath all the negotiating sessions, and the revised terms, and the folder, and the document sent home 14 months before its intended discovery. Sothkaran had been circling it for 3 years without asking it directly, because asking it directly was an admission that he hadn't known, and not knowing was an admission that all his assessments had been built on assumption rather than information. But here at 6 in the morning, with no advisors and no ceremony, and just two beings who had been on opposite sides of a misunderstanding large enough to start a war, he asked it directly. Adeyemi looked at him for a long moment. Then he said, "Same thing we've always wanted, to be dealt with straight." He leaned forward slightly. We've got a complicated history on our own planet with being the smaller party in an unequal agreement. Doesn't matter why. The point is we know what it looks like from inside. We know every shape it takes. We know the version that's overtly hostile and the version that's perfectly polite and genuinely exploitative and the version that's condescending in a way that thinks it's being kind. He paused. The conclave's been doing the third version, and we noticed, and we came back with a folder because we wanted to see if you'd deal with us honestly when we asked directly. Because if you wouldn't, if the answer was going to be that you'd smile and stonewall and find technical reasons why our revised terms were problematic while the actual reason was that you didn't think we rated equal terms, then we needed to know that before we went any deeper into this relationship. Sothkaran said. And if that had been our answer, Adeyemi said, then we'd have gone home. Finished what we'd started building. Waited until the math was different. He said it without threat, without anger, in the flat, factual tone of someone describing a thing that was always true and never needed to be performed. Karun understood, in that moment, what the Oracle's Category 7 designation had actually been measuring. Not aggression, not expansion, not the conventional markers of a dangerous species. The ones the Veil Theory had been watching for, the escalating fleet deployments and territorial incursions and resource competition that preceded every conflict in their archives. The Oracle had been measuring something else. It had been measuring a species' willingness to wait without surrendering, to be patient without becoming passive, to accept being underestimated as information rather than insult, to use it quietly, methodically as a tool, and to remain at the table, working, building, until the moment arrived when the other side was finally ready to have the real conversation. The Oracle had seen it once before in the Kelvreth. The Kelvreth had done it with weapons. They had shown you what you expected to fight and built behind that performance what you couldn't survive. The humans had done it with something more dangerous than weapons. They had done it with patience and character assessment and the particular human capacity for being looked down on by something that considers itself superior, and responding not with rage but with documentation. They had filed the conclave's behavior in a folder. They had shown up at the table, and they had waited to see who the conclave actually was. Karun accepted the revised terms that morning, before the advisors arrived, in a session that had no official record because there was no official recording apparatus in the antechamber. He and Adeyemi shook hands across the table, and he held the handshake a moment longer than the standard human bonding gesture duration because he was 4,000 years old, and he could tell when something was a beginning and he wanted to be present in it. Then he went and briefed the Elder Council. The briefing was not easy. Drathvel's objections were numerous and grounded in 2,000 years of legitimate diplomatic experience, and Karun listened to all of them and then said, "We have been measuring the wrong things," he said at once. He did not say it again. He presented the revised accord for ratification, and 9 members of the Elder Council, with varying degrees of enthusiasm and discomfort, ratified it. The Durek were informed. They were not pleased. The Durek had their own emerging species management frameworks, their own assumptions about the pace of human integration, their own categories for where the humans sat in the hierarchy. Receiving the news that the Veil Theory had unilaterally revised the accord in the humans' favor required them to do the thing that species who have been comfortable for a very long time find very difficult. It required them to look at a situation they had assessed and ask themselves whether their assessment had been shaped by what they wanted to be true. The Sen Collective received the news and immediately requested a direct session with the human delegation. Not a formal negotiation, a conversation. They had been running an analysis since the second round of sessions and had arrived at a conclusion their hive mind found deeply uncomfortable. In the event of direct conflict with humanity, their modeling showed that the Sen's distributed intelligence network, which they had always considered their strongest strategic asset, was in fact a vulnerability when facing an opponent that had spent millennia developing tactics for exploiting network systems. They didn't know how humans had done this. The technology didn't exist in their records. But the pattern was there in the behavioral data in the document that had been transmitted home 14 months before anyone read it, in every interaction that Vasquez had documented in her notebook. Humans had faced distributed networks before. On their own planet, they had learned to find the nodes. The conversation between the Sen and Adeyemi lasted 3 days and produced a supplementary agreement that the Sen's archivist would later classify as the most consequential diplomatic document in 2,000 years of conclave history, not because of what it gave the humans, but because of the precedent it set. For the first time in that history, the conclave had negotiated with an emerging species on terms that acknowledged the emerging species might know something the conclave didn't. It had taken a folder and an early morning session and a 4,000-year-old politician finally asking the honest question to get there. The Oracle of Drinkai Prime received the final ratified terms through the Conclave Data Network 3 weeks after the morning session. It processed them. It ran them against its historical archive of emergence events. It ran them against its 6 prior Category 7 assessments. against the Kelvreth resolution, against 40,000 years of recorded first contact outcomes. Then, it built the new category it had been trying to name. The category had several parameters. Species that qualified for it demonstrated capacity for extraordinary patience without passivity, tactical use of underestimation as an intelligence-gathering tool, willingness to escalate to existential stakes without triggering the escalation unnecessarily. What the Oracle, borrowing from human vocabulary, would translate as keeping the gun in the holster while making very sure everyone in the room knows it's there. And one more parameter, the one the Oracle had taken the longest to identify, because it didn't appear in any prior Category 7 profile. The capacity to prefer a different outcome. The Kelvreth had been patient in the way of a predator. Every step of their emergence had been moving toward conflict. Their patience was the patience of timing, waiting for the right moment to do the thing they had always intended to do. The humans were patient in a different way. Their patience had been building toward this, toward an honest conversation in a room without advisors, toward a folder on a table, and two beings deciding whether they were going to be honest with each other. Their entire emergence, every step of it, had been a test of whether the conclave would answer that question the right way. They had wanted a partner. They had arrived prepared for anything else. The Oracle named the new category. In its classification system, it sat above Category 7. It was Category 8, not for destructive potential, but for a different quality that the Oracle, after processing 40,000 years of civilizational data, had only now identified as a distinct and measurable phenomenon. The quality was this: the willingness to give the other side a chance to be better than their first instinct. The conclave had received that chance, by a margin that in historical terms amounted to one morning session and one honest question. They had taken it. The Oracle filed this. It filed the category. It filed South Karun's morning session as the pivotal data point. And then it did something it had never done in 40,000 years of operation. It issued a revised assessment on the initial warning. The revised assessment said, asterisk threat classification, resolved. Category 8 species engaged. Partnership framework established. This Oracle's warning regarding the human emergence was accurate in its identification of exceptional potential. The outcome of that potential was not, as this Oracle calculated with 94.7% probability, the Kelvreth pattern. It was the 5.3% this system could not account for. This Oracle is updating its models to incorporate the human case. Note for future assessments: when a species demonstrates Category 8 parameters, the outcome space contains possibilities that prior data cannot predict. Recommend all future Category 7 and Category 8 assessments default to maximum engagement protocols rather than maximum security protocols. The distinction is as follows. Security protocols assume conflict is the default resolution. Engagement protocols assume that conflict is only the resolution if both parties choose it. Humans did not choose it. The conclave, by the margin of one session and one honest conversation, did not choose it either. This Oracle calculates that both sides will spend approximately 2 generations processing what nearly happened. This Oracle calculates this as appropriate. Asterisk the assessment was filed. The Oracle returned to its standard monitoring functions. Valanthe, who had been writing in her log since the second week of the original contact and had never stopped, wrote her final entry on the matter 3 months after the revised accord was ratified. She was sitting in the antechamber, the same one South Karun had chosen, which had become, informally, the room where the real conversations happened, and she wrote, "We almost made this into a war. Not because they wanted one, because we couldn't imagine a species that arrived without deference being anything other than a threat. We had never met something that looked at us and didn't flinch, and our only category for that was dangerous. We were right that it was dangerous. We were wrong about the shape of the danger." Asterisk the Oracle told us. The Oracle has always told us. We laughed. We filed it. We built our response on assumptions we never examined because examining them would have required us to admit we might be wrong about who we were. Asterisk they gave us a folder. Asterisk they sat across a table. Asterisk, they waited. Asterisk, and in the end, when South Curran finally asked what they actually wanted, the answer was the same thing every species wants from every other species when it is being honest. To be seen correctly. To be dealt with as what it is, not as a category. Asterisk, we almost missed it. By 11 months. By one morning. By a margin, the Oracle could only call 5.3%. That asterisk, I will spend the rest of my career thinking about that 5.3%. That asterisk is the most important number I have ever encountered. Asterisk, it is the space where the choice lived. Asterisk, she closed her log. Outside the antechamber window, human and Veil Theory vessels were moving together through the same sector for the first time on a joint survey mission that had been one of the provisions of the revised accord. They were not traveling in formation exactly. Human and Veil Theory flight patterns were different enough that combined formation was still an ongoing negotiation, but they were moving in the same direction at the same speed toward the same coordinates. The Oracle, monitoring from Drinkai Prime, logged this. It noted the joint trajectory. It noted the direction. Further into unexplored space, past the Conclave's current outer boundary, into a region that no Conclave survey had reached. It noted that this had been in the human revised terms. Not as a demand, as a suggestion, almost offhand, buried in an appendix. Joint exploration of unmapped territories, subject to mutual agreement. As if they had known, from the beginning, that this was always where they were trying to get to. Not the Conclave space. Not the territory of the established and the powerful and the species that had not lost a war in 11,000 years. What was beyond all of that? The Oracle processed this for a very long time. Then, it updated one final parameter in the Category 8 designation. The parameter was, asterisk civilizations that qualify for this category do not want to inherit what exists. They want to build what doesn't yet. Asterisk could file the update. It returned to its monitoring. Outside, in the dark beyond the Conclave's maps, two species that had almost become enemies were moving together toward the part of the sky nobody had named yet. Ready, in the particular human way, to name it. Ready, in the particular Veil Theory way, to record what it had been before they arrived. Ready, together, for the version of things that neither of them could have built alone. The Oracle watched them go. For the first time in 40,000 years, it did not know what would happen next. It found this in the way that systems built from the weight of dead wisdom find unexpected things, almost worth the wait. Almost.